is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The UK government reverses its controversial plan to scrap the top rate of income tax for the richest people after a fierce backlash.
Britain's pound sterling rises following those reports of the government's U-turn, hitting $1.12 early on Monday.
Ukrainian troops have made what's been called their biggest breakthrough in the south of the country since the war began.
Indonesia launches an independent investigation into the stampede that left 125 people dead and at least 320 injured. And
meet the ancestors, the Nobel Prize winner who cracked the story of the relatives of modern humans. The UK government has reversed its controversial plan to scrap the top rate of income tax for the highest earners after a fierce backlash. Prime Minister Liz Truss and Finance Minister Kwasi Kwarteng agreed on the U-turn, saying the uproar surrounding the tax cut was distracting from their broader economic policies.
Britain's pound sterling rose following those reports of the government's U-turn, hitting $1.12 early on Monday. That's the highest level since late September, when Kwarteng announced the raft of tax cuts, which sent markets tumbling and saw the pound drop to a record low against the US dollar.
But the government's tax reversal did little to ease market turmoil. London's FTSE 100 tumbled 1.1% at the open, its lowest level since March. It pared back some of those losses, though, to finish the day in positive territory. France's CAC and Germany's DAX also fell at the opening, but regained slightly. Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson is following the story for us. So, Andrew, the UK's finance minister giving the speech of his life at the party conference, but has he done enough to save his skin?
Well, he's certainly working hard at it. I mean, I think it's been such an interesting 10 days, and people will be drawing their conclusions now about just what this government is capable of and what this government isn't capable of. 10 days of saying we're sticking to our guns, 10 days of saying, no, we're cutting the top rate of tax. I know you find that offensive. Some of you may have a problem. But in the end, it wasn't the opposition that caused this U-turn. It wasn't the markets that caused this U-turn. It wasn't even media commentators that caused it. It was their own MPs. Admittedly, probably mostly MPs who had supported Rishi Sunak in the leadership competition. But nonetheless, the potential rebellion was so strong that in order to clear the air for this speech to take place and for his other elements of agenda to be announced to the conference, they needed to get this issue out of the way. So an embarrassing, humiliating, really, really sudden U-turn. It's difficult to understate quite how embarrassing this will have been for this new administration with Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, but nonetheless, it went ahead. Then Kwasi Kwarteng takes to the stage. He's not quite as bullish as he was, I have to say, when he delivered his mini-budget 10 days ago. He had been doing a media round this morning saying, he's listened to people, he's taken advice, he has realised perhaps that this business of the tax rate was getting in the way of things, was a distraction, he called it. And so he did take to the stage, delivered pretty similar kind of information that people had expected before. Low tax, let's go for growth. This is an element of a bit of what he had to say today.
What a day. It has been tough, but we need to focus on the job in hand. We need to move forward. No more distractions, we have a plan, and we need to get on and deliver it. That's what the public expects. But I can be frank. I know the plan put forward only 10 days ago has caused a little turbulence. I get it. We are listening and have listened. And now I want to focus on delivering the major parts of our growth package.
What's interesting was the concentration on delivering this plan. In another part of the speech, Kwasi Kwarteng paid tribute to the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Bank of England as great institutions. These are the parties that should have been involved all along in the calculation and the forecasting of his mini-budget, but were so absent when he brought it out and caused all this turmoil. It looks as if at least what Kwasi Kwarteng is doing is saying, I get it, I need to have these other oversight organisations on board with me, and we'll bring them soon. But will it be soon enough?
Governments and leaders around the world might well be watching this, wondering what the lessons are. What are they?
The big step forward for your ideology doesn't always sit that well with the broader markets. If you've got a country like the UK, it's a G7 economy, it's one of the biggest economies in the world, it is completely in lockstep one way or the other with the other big economies. So the first people to look at the loss of value of government debt in the UK was the Americans, thinking, well, we don't need this kind of contagion coming to hit the Fed. So there's all that responsibility that goes with it. So if you have an ideological programme, as this government has clearly got in terms of fast growth and low taxes, then it pays to bring people on board before you put your foot so hard on the accelerator. Because what we saw 10 days ago was, as the government accelerated forward with this idea, much of it to surprise of people around the country, the Bank of England immediately had to react by putting its foot on the brakes to slow down the effects of that and start tackling the interest rate threat that came with those policies that Kwasi Kwarteng has announced partially and hinted at to come later in the time. So there is no great independence. If you're suddenly a far right of centre government in a developed economy, you can't just go ahead and crash your way through hoping you can bring the support with you, because the support doesn't just come from your own economy and your own financial institutions. It comes from a cooperation from around the world.
So this episode hasn't played well for the Finance Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, or the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, but surely the Conservative Party can't face another leadership election.
I think that's right. I think a lot of MPs loyal to Liz Truss have burnt some of their reputations with their constituents, because they've spent the last 10 days defending this tax hike, this cancellation of the top rate of tax as well, only to find them, when it's convenient, to do a U-turn and turn their back on it. So there's a bit of egg on everyone's face at the moment. So there is that for them to get over. But I think the markets will now have their attention drawn to these question marks over the government's performance. They may have a chance yet to pull that back and start impressing people again. But thus far, let's be frank, the figures haven't been that exciting. The pound's shifted a bit, but the dollar's got its own problems today as well.
Andrew, thank you very much for that. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson.
Well, let's get some reaction from Wall Street now and talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. So, John, is the UK tax U-turn having an impact where you are?
Oh, yes, no doubt about it. We all saw the Sun newspaper, the old current bun, breaking this news about whatever it was, 12, 18 hours ago, something like that. And I think I set my alarm early this morning. The news came from the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, about 2:20 this morning for me here on Wall Street. Others did the same, I know. I mean, this is the thing that Andrew was saying. We're in this globalized situation now where people have noticed what happened last week when the Bank of England moved. To be fair, this is not the only climb down, and what a climb down it is, by the way, from this government in recent history. Back in 2015, when George Osborne was the finance minister, they did a U-turn on something similar to do with tax credits. But what is different this time is that President Biden got involved and the IMF got involved. As Andrew was saying, they were concerned about contagion coming here to the United States, particularly affecting pension funds and that sort of thing. And I think they were really wary of this borrowing to fund tax cuts, particularly that cut to 45 pence in the pound for the upper earners. And what I'm noticing is here in America, there is definite move away from the trickle-down economics that we've lived with since the 1980s, espoused by President Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher, the notion that you favour in taxation those higher earners and then it will then trickle down to the rest of us. That seems to have gone in the world that we inhabit at the moment. That really is not in vogue anymore, in favour of actually taxing the rich. And, but the Bank of England did what it did on Wednesday. That actually benefited the 10-year yield here, and stocks went up sharply on Wednesday for us, but they were down again on Thursday and, of course, on Friday. And I will tell you, they're up today, but what Wall Street really wants more than anything, rather than to have to pay attention to what's happening in London, is they would like the Federal Reserve to pause with its interest rate hiking. They were expecting the bank to hike and pause, giving them a chance to catch up. And that isn't really what's happening. And ever since Jackson Hole, the chairman of the central bank, Jerome Powell, has been very, very, very hawkish, saying he's going to keep on hiking until the job is done. And I think the markets would like to see in November that they don't hike by 75 basis points. They do maybe a little bit less, just giving the markets a chance to breathe and work out what's going on. So a very strong rally today. The Dow's up 2%, pretty much the Nasdaq and the S&P 500 are as well, getting October off to a good start. But I must remind you of the multiple days we've had where we've started strongly and only ended up in the red, and indeed vice versa. Robin and Jamie?
And John, what are you hearing about Credit Suisse?
Yes, well, this, of course, is a major Swiss investment bank, and the news started on Friday when the CEO sent out an email saying they intend to raise capital, but telling everybody that they were financially healthy. Now, the problem with Credit Suisse is that people have been exiting the bank at all sorts of levels. So from the C-suite, management, all sorts of levels, morale is said to be very low there. And the problem from Wall Street's perspective is that we remember this is exactly what happened with Lehman Brothers at the height of the financial crash back in 2008. So that is the problem here. Now, Credit Suisse shares are $3 or $4 a piece now. They're up a little bit at the moment, but they were down 10% earlier today in Europe. Their credit default swaps, which is like an insurance policy, have been going through the roof. And I understand management is talking to Wall Street executives to reassure them that everything will be okay. But, you know, it's another little thing to worry about here.
And, John, a quick word about Kim Kardashian, who's been fined.
Yes. Well, it's nice to talk a bit about show business occasionally, isn't it? What's happened is Kim Kardashian of the Kardashian family has been caught promoting a token called Ethereum Max. Now, it's part of the Ethereum family, second biggest cryptocurrency. It's a spin-off token. Basically, she was promoting it on Instagram as an influencer. The leading regulator has fined her $1.3 million and told her not to promote any cryptocurrency for the next 3 years at least. The SEC says that product is just not for everybody and certainly not for many of her fans. Her lawyer says, look, we paid the fine, we want to just get it behind us and move on. I think there was a little ad tag on the Instagram page, so I'm not quite sure why nobody spotted it earlier, but anyway, it's happened. And as you know, it's always fun keeping up with the Kardashians.
John, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, John Terrett, in Wall Street.
Let's talk to Craig Earlham, Senior Market Analyst at Uganda. Craig, welcome back to the show. Thank you very much for your time. The UK Finance Minister just been speaking at his party's conference. What's your sense? Are investors' concerns going to be calmed by what he said?
No, not particularly. I'm not even sure the Tory party members are going to be calmed by what he said. It all sounds very bullish, it all sounds very optimistic, but ultimately it doesn't answer the questions that everyone has, which went far beyond the 45% rate of tax. It was, how are you going to pay for the other tax cuts? And these are the things which he's still saying we're going to have to wait until the November budget to hear about. And until we get some clear answers on that, then I think the markets are going to remain very uneasy. This idea that we can just cut spending to fund these enormous tax measures is a bit hard to take. We know that a lot of low-hanging fruit and more was captured by David Cameron and George Osborne during the austerity years of the 2010s. This idea that you can just find tens of billions of pounds of low-hanging fruit at this point seems hard to fathom, which means there's going to be some extremely difficult decisions to make, which could have economic consequences and could potentially still be inflationary, which means higher interest rates are going to be necessary. They've got a lot of questions to answer if they want this ambitious growth plan. And we should state there's nothing wrong with an ambitious growth plan. But as Michael Gove put it yesterday, tax cuts may be conservative, but loading debt up in order to pay for them is absolutely not.
What's the word on the trading floor on the government's actions? What are you hearing? What are people talking about?
Well, as you say, it's the unease with which they've approached this. It's almost the arrogance with which they've approached this. The idea that they can make all these announcements without having to justify them, without having to explain how they're going to pay for them, without the independent OBR giving its forecast on the back of them. That's what's really concerning people, and that's why we've seen so much unease in the markets over the course of the last 10 days. The unpredictability of the government. The UK is meant to be a source of stability. It's meant to be a source of reliability, and we've absolutely not seen that over the course of the last 10 days. The Bank of England should not have to be bailing out the government because of its indifference to the financial markets and how they perceive to its indifference to the public and the perception and also elsewhere. And this is the biggest concern. The UK government has to learn a big lesson here, because clearly they prioritised putting a lot of measures in place which they knew would be deeply unpopular alongside an energy bill cap that they knew would be popular, and perhaps in the hope that one will offset to a large extent the other. That is not the way they do things. The reason why the OBR exists and the reason why it publishes forecasts is to generate confidence in the markets, and what they did achieve the absolute opposite.
Let's look more widely over the coming days. What else do we need to be on the lookout for markets-wise this week?
Well, I think the key this week is going to be the US jobs report. I think that goes without saying each month. We've got the OPEC Plus meeting on Wednesday. That's going to have a big impact for everyone because we're only just starting to now see the impact of slightly lower oil prices. People are filling up their cars, realising that it's not quite as expensive as it was just a few months ago. And now OPEC Plus stands ready to cut production by quite a significant amount. It looks as though it's going to be at least 1 million barrels a day they're going to be cut by the alliance. And it could even be more if we see a unilateral additional cut from Saudi Arabia. A press conference will accompany that as well. So that will be of extreme interest to the markets. But it seems like they've decided that this is the bottom in the oil markets. They're potentially also in agreement finally that the global economic outlook is looking a little bit more dire. And that's something that has helped drive the oil price down. And they want to see it back towards $90, maybe even $100 a barrel. We'll learn a lot more about that on Wednesday, but that could be a real key event considering the global economy is facing a bit of a sticky patch. Higher oil prices are obviously not going to help that or the inflation problem. So a lot of eyes on Wednesday, and then, of course, that US jobs report on Friday.
Craig, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme again. Craig Earlham, Senior Market Analyst at Oanda.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we take stock of the war in Ukraine. What's next for Russia and Kyiv's allies?
I can't wait to tell the story of the real China to the world.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
I'm travelling around China, introducing China to the world. There are so many stories here to tell.
So my family has been connected with China now for almost 150 years. My task now is to set us up for the next 150 years.
Each side has a huge amount to offer the other. Neither is right or wrong, and each can learn from the other.
These are the foundations that create the links between ordinary people.
Trying to see China as a process rather than a fixed point.
Over the last 25 years, I've been connecting China with Scotland, Angus with Yantai.
We should be encouraging even greater two-way exchange.
By far the most important thing is to tell stories.
Manchester's been my home and Wuhan is my second home.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
If we can build bridges, we can learn more from one another. That can only lead to good things for both sides.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV. YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Ukrainian troops have made what's been called their biggest breakthrough in the south of the country since the war began.
They've moved further into areas annexed by Moscow, advancing along the Dnipro River and threatening to encircle thousands of Russian troops. The Russians have described the situation as tense. These latest gains come a day after Kyiv retook the key Russian stronghold of Lyman in Donetsk.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Sergio Olmos, who's in Kyiv. So, Sergio, Ukraine has made a major breakthrough in the annexed Kherson region.
That's right. It shouldn't be underestimated. Ukraine's now broken through the defenses in the Kherson region. This is a strategic and politically important area. It comes on the back of the Kharkiv counteroffensive that we know has gained more than 6,000 kilometers of territory and has broken through into the Luhansk region. In the east, Ukraine now controls, obviously, the city of Liman, a strategic railway hub that Russia was using to supply its troops in the eastern front there. Now Ukraine has it. It's one of the regions that Vladimir Putin had said now belong to Russia. it's the Donetsk region, but now in the south, in Kherson, another region that Vladimir Putin has said is annexed and belongs to Russia. Ukrainian forces are pushing through. Last night, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that 2 settlements had been liberated. We know from the Russian side there have been a number of statements that confirm that indeed Ukrainian forces have broken through. One of them from a Russian-backed official saying, quote, have broken through a little deeper, referring to Ukrainians. Another saying, when asked about this is the head of the Kherson, it's tense, let's put it that way. Ukrainian forces have been seeing almost similar to what they saw in the Kharkiv region, which is Russian forces seem to be overwhelmed. Their defenses do not seem to be holding up. They're moving faster than we expected. In Kharkiv, it was a lightning offensive. We're seeing something similar now in Kherson, with town after town now being liberated every night.
Sergio, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Sergio Olmos, in Kyiv.
Well, the lower house of the Russian parliament has approved the takeover of the 4 occupied regions of Ukraine. No lawmaker in the State Duma voted against the laws and treaties which will formally incorporate Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporizhia into Russia. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said he was confident the upper house would also approve these measures.
Indonesia is launching an independent investigation into a stampede that left 125 people dead at a football stadium. 32 children were among those killed, and at least 320 people were injured in one of the world's worst ever stadium disasters. Fans of the losing home side rushed the pitch, but many were crushed as they tried to flee after police fired tear gas. Our correspondent Sulkina Aliwalia reports.
On Saturday night, Fatir was at a football match, watching his favorite team play. What was supposed to be a celebration turned into chaos. Fatir attended the match with his cousin, 24-year-old Mita. Today, he's mourning her death.
Saudara saya di tribun 13 itu yang My cousin was in stand number 13, which was the worst hit by the tear gas. Everybody panicked. They didn't know where to run, and none of the doors were open. I felt my eyes sting and my chest tight.
Pintu itu belum dibuka. Sedangkan gas air mata itu sudah ke atas tribun.
Amid the chaos, Mita was trampled to death. Fatir survived, but he says he cannot live in peace until justice is served.
Kok bisa gitu? Kok bisa kejadian seperti itu kemarin itu?
How could this have happened? How can the police allow this to happen? I'm still haunted and traumatized by the cries of help of that night. I don't even have the appetite to eat. I hope the police take responsibility for this tragedy.
Tapi kesalahan saya itu kenapa ya?
Authorities say 18 police officers who fired the tear gas are now in questioning.
It's been a few days since the incident, and now people are paying their tributes to the hundreds of lives that were lost at the Kanjuruhan Stadium. Analysts say that Indonesia is likely to pay a very high price for this incident. The use of weapons or tear gas is prohibited inside the stadium by FIFA. Now, whether or not the Indonesian police was aware of this is still unclear.
President Joko Widodo has ordered to launch a serious investigation into the matter. But right now, the main priority, he says, is providing care and support to the victims still in recovery. At this hospital in Malang, many riot victims are still under intensive care, and doctors say they share similar issues.
Ya, yang derita kebanyakan ini seperti yang kemarin saya laporkan adalah multiple.
Most of the victims here have suffered multiple trauma or lack of oxygen. Some of them are still arriving 2 days after this incident. They're only just feeling the impact now.
Kan kebutuhannya tinggi.
This is now known as one of the worst sporting incidents in the world. The Indonesia Football Association has suspended all games until a thorough investigation is complete. Sulkina Aliwalia, CGTN, Malang.
Well, let's take you back to one of our main stories. Ukrainian troops have made what's been called their biggest breakthrough in the south of the country since the war began. Let's talk to Professor Michael Clark, former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute. Michael, welcome back to the programme. All these months in then, give us, I guess, what the military would call a sit-rep. How would you evaluate Ukraine's counter-offensive?
Well, it's certainly moving pretty quickly in the Donbass region, or just north of the Donbass. Having taken Lyman last week, the Ukrainian troops are moving pretty quickly on Crimea, and they're cutting Russian supply lines north-south. And once Russian supply lines are cut, which effectively they are being cut now as we speak, then the Russians will have a real problem in holding on to more territories in that part of the area. Meanwhile, down in the southwest, a lot of news in the last 48 hours that Russian forces have been under greater pressure in the Kherson region, particularly west of the river Dnieper. And although the front lines haven't moved very much in recent weeks, those of us who are taking an interest in this could see that Russian forces were under increasing pressure as they were running out of supplies, particularly ammunition. And it looks as if there's some breakthroughs now from the north, moving towards Novokakhovka, and also from the west, moving towards Kherson itself. But the Russians will defend Kherson very fiercely, I think. They might crack in Novokakhovka, further north, but Kherson is very important to them. It's the only city, the only significant city the Russians occupy in all this area that they now claim as their territory, so they won't give it up easily. And I think we'll see a very tough fight there. But certainly the Ukrainians are making progress now in two places at once, in the northeast, in Kharkiv and north of the Donbass, and now in the southwest around Kherson.
You talk about the importance of supply lines. In layman's terms, what are the other key factors allowing the Ukrainian military to successfully regain territory in much quicker time, it seems, than it took the Russians to occupy it?
Well, it's about 100 different things. But if you had to sum them up, you'd say it's because the Ukrainians are fighting like a Western army. And that's not surprising, because they've been training like a Western army since 2014, when they started from scratch, as it were, having been beaten so badly in 2014. That, after all, is 80 years ago now. They started from the ground up. So they're doing the basics. They've learned infantry tactics. They've learned to operate in small units, and they are now behaving and are equipped like a Western army. So they're running this dual offensive very much in the way that Western forces would run it if they were trying the same sort of thing. And there's any number of different reasons why it's working, but that's the fundamental difference. The Russians are still operating really a 20th century army based on the old Red Army, to be honest, and the Ukrainians are operating a sort of 21st century Western army with combined units between air and ground and intelligence and command and control and so on.
What do you make of the repeated nuclear threats coming from Russia?
It's very hard to think that they could be credible, to be honest, because a theatre nuclear weapon, a TNF as it's called, would make very little impression on the battlefield as a whole. In order to do anything useful in battlefield terms, the Russians would have to use, let's say, a 10 kiloton airburst weapon, and that would, as it would, destroy places like Lyman. So Lyman is now full of Ukrainian troops. They could destroy a town like Lyman with a 10 kiloton airburst. But that immediately would cause fallout, which would go into Russia. And the taboo against using any nuclear weapons is now very, very strong. I mean, since, it's 75 years old. And that taboo gets stronger all the time. And so the first country to break that taboo, and somebody will break it eventually, but the first country to break it will be subject to international condemnation and probably isolation. But I think if President Putin broke the nuclear taboo by using even a small theatre nuclear weapon, then I think even the Chinese would drop him, to be honest. I think he'd be absolutely on his own. I don't think he would survive the scandal or the issue that would be created by that. And the battlefield advantage is very, very small.
Michael, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Professor Michael Clark, the former Director General of the Royal United Services Institute.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Back to the ballot box in Brazil. A surprisingly tight result in Sunday's election means Lula and Bolsonaro face a runoff for the presidency.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be, CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Ukrainian troops have made what's being described as their biggest breakthrough in the south of the country since the war began.
Indonesia launches an independent investigation into the stampede that left 125 people dead and at least 320 people injured.
And the UK government reverses its controversial plan to scrap the top rate of income tax for the richest people following a fierce backlash.
Well, let's talk now to Mark Shanahan, who's Associate Professor of Politics at the University of Surrey. Welcome back to the programme, Mark. So we've had within the past hour or so the UK's Finance Minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, standing up at his party's conference and admitting that he got cutting the top rate of tax wrong. He described the reaction to what happened as a little turbulence, but will he and his party be forgiven for this?
Probably not, on two fronts. I mean, we have quite some time before they have to go to the country for a general election. But there hasn't exactly been a massive boost to the markets today or to the pound today. There's been some upward movement following the reversal of the 45% tax cut. But the public are considerably worried now as to whether they can trust this Conservative government. It's not just this 45p tax rate. It's a whole uncosted budget that was delivered to the public as a bit of a surprise a week last Friday and still hasn't been costed and doesn't look as though it's going to be costed for another month and a half. And it looks as though there are going to be cuts and quite jagged cuts to public spending, and that never goes down particularly well with the public. So certainly the media, the public, and even the markets are not in particularly forgiving mood yet.
So where does this U-turn leave this government's economic policy?
Pretty much on life support at the moment. The next couple of days at conference are going to be very, very interesting. This is when the Conservative Party comes together every year with a new leader and a new chancellor. This should have been the honeymoon. This should have been the rousing speeches full of good news, but it doesn't feel like that at all. The mood is very subdued. The room is half empty. They're now even talking about bussing actors and actresses in to fill the seats for the new Prime Minister's speech. This is a Conservative Party that's been in power for 12 years. This was going to be their rabbit out of a hat. It looks like a very right-wing, libertarian economic policy, which hasn't even landed particularly well with their own party.
So what lesson can other governments from around the world learn from this?
Don't spring surprises. So the markets hate surprises. They don't like uncertainty. So to come out with, actually it was policies that had been trailed fairly heavily during the Conservative leadership campaign, but then to land them in a supercharged way without saying how they were going to be paid for really did spook everybody. It's left the government looking relatively incompetent. They have to now recover quickly from that. And for any other governments around the world, take this as an object lesson in how not to sell in a new economic policy.
So you say it's left them looking relatively incompetent. Can they recover from this?
Of course they can. They've got a near 80-seat majority in Parliament. They don't need to go to the country, but they have to act quickly, rather more pragmatically than the ideological spin that we've seen for the last 10 days, and perhaps with a little bit more humility than Kwasi Kwarteng, who is a very, very bright guy. He is super, uber self-confident, but that maybe just tipped over into arrogance in the last 10 days or so. He's been brought back down to earth by this reversal of that top-rate tax policy. As he goes through and explains a lot of the other economic changes, everything from childcare to housing policy, he's going to have to be rather more in listening mode than in the kind of directive, this is how it's going to be, we're going to stick the course mode that he's been in up until now. Liz Truss just has to show leadership. We really haven't seen that so far.
Mark Shanahan from the University of Surrey, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Brazil is heading back to the ballot box after the election produced no clear winner. The two leading candidates for president, the incumbent Jair Bolsonaro and his rival Lula da Silva, will now face each other in a runoff in 4 weeks. Despite being ahead in the opinion polls, the left-wing challenger Lula fell short of the 50% needed for outright victory. The current president, the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro, beat the expectations to keep his hopes of a second term alive. Well, let's talk to the Associated Press correspondent Philip Crowther, who's in Rio de Janeiro. Philip, Bolso outperformed the polling. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, well, we had a winner here yesterday in Lula da Silva, but the triumph was for Bolsonarismo, as it is called here, because there were some very significant advances here for Bolsonaro candidates, if you will, those who are on the same list as he is, or ministers who are in his cabinet managed to make it into Senate seats or congressional seats. It was a night of triumph for Bolsonarismo, not necessarily for Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president himself, because at the end of the day, he did lose this first round, but does go into that runoff election on the 30th of October, meaning we have 4 weeks of campaigning between him on one side and Lula da Silva, the left-wing candidate, on the other. Now, what Jair Bolsonaro had done before voting began here in Brazil yesterday was to warn, first of all, his supporters that the opinion polls were always wrong. And he was right in that aspect, because they were awfully wrong when it came to the actual result of the first round here in the Brazilian presidential election. One of them, the most notable one, the most trusted one, was predicting a 14 percentage point win for Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the former president and the left-wing Workers' Party candidate. Well, his advantage in the end, despite his being a win, of course, was only 5%. There had been all other warnings from Jair Bolsonaro in the forefront of this election. He said that the electronic voting system could not be trusted, that there could be widespread fraud. He never gave any evidence of that, and indeed there were no complaints from him yesterday. Indeed, Bolsonaro kept rather quiet when it comes to his warnings against the democratic institutions or the voting system. He seemed to be pretty happy with how things went yesterday.
Is Lula, do you think, still favourite for the runoff?
Yes, he is. He won this first round here in Brazil by 6.1 million votes. That is not necessarily an enormous amount, but a very difficult margin for the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, to make up. Now, the reasons why, first of all, is that there are other minor candidates, if you will, who got a very small percentage of the vote yesterday. They are more likely to shed votes and give them to a candidate like Lula da Silva, the former president, on the left. Those votes are unlikely to go toward Bolsonaro. But there is one much bigger group of voters, or rather non-voters in this case, who are available now to conquer, if you will, for these two candidates. 30 million Brazilians did not vote yesterday, despite the fact that voting is actually obligatory in this country, meaning that those 30 million people are now expected to pay what, it must be said, is a very small fine. They could be up for grabs in this second round. Now, here's one thing to think about. If Bolsonaro had been up against a candidate on the left who might not have had the past that Lula had, president for 2 terms, maybe not as charismatic as the former metal worker is, the 76-year-old man, well, maybe Bolsonaro could have won this first round outright. He did not in the end, meaning that this clash of political titans between Lula and Bolsonaro now continues. 4 weeks of campaigning until that runoff vote on the 30th of October. That is when we will have a new, or indeed an incumbent, president for Brazil.
Philip, thank you for that. Philip Crowther from the Associated Press in Rio.
Well, one of the many policy differences between Bolsonaro and Lula is on the environment. Deforestation of the Amazon rainforest has dramatically increased during President Bolsonaro's time in office. Richard Lapper is a former Latin America editor at the Financial Times. I asked him about the environmental challenges facing Lula da Silva if he wins.
Well, Lula knows that, Brazil's developed world trading partners, particularly the United States and the European Union, are very keen on green politics and on getting deforestation in the Amazon under control. He'll be hoping to leverage support from his European partners and from the US, and he'll be hoping that he can attract foreign investors into sustainable energy projects and other environmentally sound projects. Now, he will hope to do that, and he'll hope to tempt, have the prospect of that money coming in, he'll hope will work in his favour.
So what does set the two candidates apart when it comes to their approach to the economy?
Well, I think, Bolsonaro's not a great fan of green politics. Under him, the Amazon has become, a serious problem. Bolsonaro also is favoured to a certain extent, although in a very up and down way, a more free market approach to the economy. It's hard to say because, in fact, under Bolsonaro, economic policy has been driven by the needs of his own re-election in the past few months. Spending has increased to get people who've suffered over the course of the last 3 years sort of to vote for him. Living standards in Brazil have fallen since 2019. The pandemic had a very heavy toll on people's lifestyles here, and subsequently we've had this big rise in inflation. Bolsonaro's faced a lot of sort of discontent amongst poorer Brazilians, and he's been trying to who would have voted against him, and many have voted against him clearly, but he's spent a lot of money, and that's pushed the deficit up. Now, Lula's in an awkward position because he also, many of these social welfare programs, he himself 20 years ago introduced. And he's, the great champion of expanded social welfare provision for better education, better healthcare. So but that costs money, and it's going to be very difficult to increase living standards while you've got these huge pressures on your budget.
Bulgaria has held its fourth election in 18 months, but hopes that it would bring an end to political crisis appear to have been dashed. The centre-right Gerb party is on course to win the most votes, despite allegations of corruption.
But tough coalition negotiations lie ahead in a country heavily polarised between Europe and Russia. Our correspondent Evangelos Ipsas reports.
Bulgaria will be a very predictable, supportive European member, and together with all of our European friends, we can speak in one voice for the major issues of today.
It is perhaps those words and his turn to Europe that led Kirill Petkov's party to come second in the elections, behind former Prime Minister Boyko Borisov's Gerb party. With over 95% of the ballots counted, Boyko Borisov's party has won over 25% of the vote, 5 points ahead of Kirill Petkov's centrist party. These snap elections came after a fragile coalition led by Petkov lost a no-confidence vote in June. The war in Ukraine has fragmented Bulgaria's already deeply divided political scene, polarizing the country and giving pro-Russian parties a bigger voice. Political analysts say that a pro-Kremlin party will be unavoidable in the new government led by Borisov, who has in the past enjoyed a close relationship with the Kremlin.
Well, the elections last night, they showed that Bulgaria is not a pro-Putin country or something like that. But actually, it's very difficult to form a coalition which is consistently pro-European. You have to take on board some of the pro-Russian parties, like the Bulgarian Socialist Party, for instance.
Bulgaria joined the European Union 15 years ago, and it had enjoyed relative stability up until 2 years ago, when the country saw large-scale anti-government protests accusing the winner of these elections, Boyko Borisov, of corruption. Fast-forwarding 4 elections later, the country still remains in turmoil, something that analysts say is not necessarily a bad thing.
There is this problem with corruption, and these elections actually happen because some entrenched interest, and hopefully the cycle of turbulence and elections is going to help address this situation.
Now, negotiations will get underway to see who Gerb can form a coalition with. It's thought 6 or 7 smaller parties will be needed, as Petkov is unlikely to work with his political adversary. And there's no guarantee that talks will go well, with some already talking about new elections. Evangelos Ipsas for CGTN from Sofia.
Shares in Tesla were down 7% in early trading after the electric car giant sold fewer vehicles than expected in the third quarter. Production and delivery numbers hit record highs in quarter 3, but delivery numbers fell short of analyst estimates due to logistical hurdles. The unusually large gap between production and delivery has raised investor worries.
Inflation in Turkey hit a 24-year high in September, rising 83% year-on-year as President Erdogan continued with his economic policy of lowering interest rates. He's ordered the country's central bank to cut rates twice in 2 months and called for single-digit interest rates by the end of this year. September's inflation was driven by transport costs and food prices.
The company that runs Britain's biggest power station has been accused of destroying ancient woodland in Canada in an investigation by the BBC. Drax has received billions of dollars in taxpayer-funded green subsidies. The company says it only uses waste wood in its generators, but the BBC found it had bought licenses to clear 2 large forested areas.
Nestlé is axing the famous shiny plastic wrappers on its Quality Street chocolates after 86 years. It's trying to make the range more environmentally friendly. The individual sweets will now come in recyclable wax paper. Almost 2 billion Quality Street chocolates are consumed every year in the UK.
Spain is Europe's second biggest exporter of exotic fruits, with a climate that allows crops like avocados and mangoes to thrive.
But farmers say the recent drought has seen harvests shrink, along with their profits. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports.
It's late September and the Andalusian farmers are preparing for harvest. This region is home to Europe's largest avocado plantations. The produce here will be sent across the continent. Avocados are sought after but require special care. Each kilo of fruit needs 800 litres of water. However, off the back of one of the worst droughts in recent memory, farmers here are concerned.
Right now we're getting the water from natural underground reservoirs. 2 big reservoirs were built years ago close to here to provide us water when we are short on rainfall, but the authorities never made the connections needed to actually bring that water here. If we don't have water, of course, we can't keep farming.
Once picked, the fruits are then sent to distribution plants to get them ready for export across Europe. Now, this plant processes all manner of tropical fruits, from avocados to mangoes, as you can see. However, the tropical fruit industry here in Spain is facing some tough times. Climate change has affected these mangoes such that they're slightly smaller than in previous years. Added to that, the energy crisis has seen production costs soar, further reducing profit margins and placing more pressure on suppliers.
Sí que es verdad que hay un cierto
Customers are not prepared to pay more for our product, especially in this climate, as it looks like we are entering a recession, and this product is not considered essential. So even though our production costs are rising, we don't want to pass that cost on to our customers. This means our profit margins will be even more reduced.
Suppliers are hoping that energy prices will fall at some stage in the future. What is far less certain is having a climate that allows them to grow tropical fruits here in southern Spain. If the current climate projections are accurate, then plantations like this may simply not be a sustainable way of life for the farmers of Andalusia. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Granada.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Who do you think you are? The Nobel Prize-winning scientist who's cracked the story of our ancestors.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The Nobel Prize for Medicine has been awarded to the Swedish scientist Svante Pääbo for breakthroughs on human evolution.
His achievements include cracking the genetic code of Neanderthals, an extinct relative of modern humans. He also discovered a previously unknown human species from a 40,000-year-old fragment of finger bone found in Siberia. Well, Emma Keeling from our Science and Technology show, Razor, has been following the story and is here with us. So, Emma, where did Professor Pääbo hear the news?
He was at home and he got the call. He thought it was a prank, as you do. Yeah, he was overwhelmed and speechless. He actually asked whether he could tell his wife. I'm sure his wife wouldn't have wanted to find out from the media, so that was quite sweet. Shows what a humble man he is. But, yeah, there's a lovely photo of him sitting there. He's got his giant coffee cup on the table and smiling. It actually made me think, maybe I actually need to have a little bit more coffee in the morning. Maybe this is the reason why the Nobel hasn't quite got... But also, he's got the good genes, because his father, actually, a biochemist, had also won the Nobel. So, yeah, just amazing family.
Extraordinary.
It's the family, yeah.
One of his big achievements was sequencing an entire Neanderthal genome. Why is that so important to this story?
Well, I guess the big question is, for us, why are Homo sapiens surviving and thriving, and why have our ancestors, you know, why are they extinct? And so if you can answer that, then that actually helps you solve a few questions about modern science, and, you know, the implications for modern science are quite great. But to help with the answer of that question, there's actually a clip here of the professor. He spoke today at a press conference, and I think that might help.
What really drives our work is really curiosity, I would say. It is just as if you do an archaeological excavation to find out about the past, we sort of make excavations in the human genome. But there might come practical implications out of that. I mean, we have discovered, for example, that in the COVID pandemic, the greatest risk factor to become severely ill and even die when you're infected with the virus has come over to modern people from Neanderthals.
So I want to give you a little bit more context, a little bit of information about this man, because, you know, the fact that he actually sequenced the genome in the first place is quite extraordinary. Nobody thought it was possible. In fact, right up to when he actually solved it, everybody thought it was completely impossible. But as you said, Neanderthals are our closest ancestor. But he was able to, from that little bone fragment at the back of the cave, he discovered the Denisovans. And so it's this, you know, the puzzle that he's slowly putting together. And there's the other thing is the Homo sapiens. You know, we actually coexisted many moons ago with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. Nobody knew that. We had the DNA to prove that now. But also there's good DNA that's come through, and there's bad DNA that's come through. You heard him there saying that, you know, Neanderthal DNA is gives you a higher risk of actually developing diseases. With the Denisovan DNA, it actually can help with dealing with low oxygen levels, so at high altitude, and that's the modern-day Tibetans.
So whether it's good DNA or bad DNA, is it true that cannibalism actually helped preserve DNA in bones? Yes,
so he said that the best samples were coming from the bones that had sort of been found in the back of the cave, dried out. But the paleontologists have said it's probably because the Neanderthals were sort of having a chew on each other, so to speak. So, you know, the old bone fragment having a chew, thrown in the back of the cave. These caves are quite dry, they're quite cold, and actually that preserves. So there's not the microbial activity, the bacteria getting in. So it actually, you know, he had a beautiful sample from that. So weirdly, cannibalism helped him secure a Nobel Prize.
Fascinating stuff.
Amazing.
Emma, thank you very much, and you can see much more of Emma at the weekends in our science show, Razor.
Our main story, Britain's pound sterling rises on reports of that economic U-turn from the finance minister in the UK, hitting $1.12 early on Monday. Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.